Now, we left off at verse 6 of 1 Kings chapter 5 last time. The mention of an exorbitant number of horses belonging to King Solomon's monarchy was the subject. And in the preceding passages, we read of an equally exorbitant amount of food that the king's large and growing government required, and which the common folk of Israel had to supply in the form of a levy. Now, King Shlomo is as much businessman as king, and he uses that ability to make the kingdom of Israel the envy of the world. Not long after being crowned, he ran his country like a CEO runs a corporation, with economics as the overriding priority. But at this early point in his career as king, it seemed as though the spiritual man within him held the reins of his life as he went about ordering his kingdom in a way that made the lives of his citizens more prosperous, more peaceful than they had ever known, even if the burdens of centralized government and the high national aspirations of their king put an ever-growing weight upon their shoulders. For the moment, Shlomo seemed to be carefully navigating kind of along a razor's edge that balances the kind of earthly wisdom that brings fame and wealth with the higher kind that exalts a nation in God's eyes. So in his early reign, Solomon wrote down timeless words of wisdom, advice that surely, honestly represented his righteous views on matters that he faced and that we all must deal with on a day-to-day basis. In Proverbs 3, God's anointed king, who was promised unmatched divine wisdom and given long life as a conditional gift for obeying God's commandments, he says this: "Happy the person who finds wisdom, the person who acquires understanding, for her profit exceeds that of silver. Gaining her," meaning wisdom, "is better than gold. She's more precious than pearls. Nothing you want can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand, riches and honor in her left. Her ways are pleasant ways, her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who grasp her. Whoever holds fast to her will be made happy." A true and profound statement as this is, already in chapter 5, we are seeing an ominous sign that this evil inclination remained alive and well within Shlomo. So much like his father, he loved God with all of his heart on the one hand, and inexplicably on the other hand, he could not resist the temptations that the world offered to him. I think perhaps no one summed up Solomon's problem, my problem, your problem, better than the Apostle Paul. When it comes to this maddening dilemma of our knowing and loving God, and yet, inevitably, at times, what we know is wicked and destructive and shameful, we do it anyway. We find that in Romans 7:14 through 24. "For we know that the Torah is of the Spirit. But as for me, I'm bound to the old nature, sold to sin as a slave. I don't understand my own behavior. I don't do what I want to do. Instead, I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I'm doing what I don't want to do, then I'm agreeing that the Torah is good. But now it's no longer the real me doing it, it's the sin that's housed inside of me. For I know there's nothing good housed inside of me, that is, inside my old nature. Oh, I can want what's good, but I can't do it. For I don't do the good I want. Instead, the evil I don't want's what I do. But if I'm doing what the real me doesn't want, then it's no longer the real me doing it, it's the sin that's housed inside of me. So I find it to be the rule, kind of a perverse Torah, that although I want to do what's good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner self, I completely agree with God's Torah. But in my various parts, I see a different kind of Torah. One that battles with the Torah in my mind, and instead it makes me a prisoner of sin's Torah, which is operating in my various parts. Oh, what a miserable creature I am. Who will rescue me from this body bound for death? As much as God had given to Solomon, he didn't have what even the poorest, the weakest, the most oppressed believer has today to help him. Christ. Let's reread a portion of 1 Kings chapter 5. I want to remind you that if you're following along with a Bible that's based on the Greek Septuagint, what I'm about to read is going to be for you in chapter 4, starting in verse 29. Otherwise, if you have a Hebrew-based Bible or a complete Jewish Bible, we're going to be starting at 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 9. And we're going to go on to the end. And if you have a complete Jewish Bible, you'll find that at page 372. 372. Starting at verse 9. God gave Shlomo exceptional wisdom and understanding, as well as a heart as vast as the sandy beach by the sea. Shlomo's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of the people from the east, all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than anyone, wiser than Etan the Ezrahi, and wiser than Haman and Calcol and Darda, the sons of Machol, so that his fame spread to all of the surrounding nations. He composed 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. He could discuss trees from the cedar in the Lebanon to the hyssop growing out of the wall. He could discuss wild animals and poultry, reptiles and fish. People from all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, including kings from all over the earth who'd heard of his wisdom. Hiram, king of Zor, sent his servants to Shlomo because he had heard that they had anointed him king in his father's place, and Hiram had always loved David. And Shlomo returned this message to Hiram: "You know that David, my father, wasn't able to build a house for the name of Adonai, his God, because of the wars that beset him from every side, until Adonai put his enemies under the soles of my feet. But now Adonai, my God, has given me rest on every side. There's neither adversary nor calamity. So now I intend to build a house for the name of Adonai, my God, in keeping with what Adonai said to David, my father, your son, whom I will put on your throne in your place. He will be the one to build the house for my name. Therefore, order your people to cut down cedar trees from the Lebanon for me. My servants will be with your servants. I will pay your servants according to everything you say. For you know that we have no one among us as skilled in felling trees as the Zidonim." Now when Hiram heard Shlomo's message, he was very happy. And he said, "Blessed be Adonai today, who has given David a wise son to rule this great people." Then Hiram sent Shlomo this message: "I have heard the message you sent me, and I will do everything you want concerning cedar logs and cypress logs. My servants will bring them down from the Lebanon to the sea. I'll make them into rafts to go by sea to wherever place you tell me, and I will have them broken up there, and you will receive them. You will compensate me by providing food for my household." So Hiram gave Shlomo all the cedar logs and cypress logs he wanted. Shlomo gave Hiram 100,000 bushels of wheat as food for his household, and 1,000 gallons of oil from pressed olives. That is what Shlomo gave Hiram each year. Adonai gave Shlomo wisdom as he promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Shlomo. The two of them formed an alliance together. Now King Solomon conscripted 30,000 men from all Israel for forced labor. He sent them to the Lebanon in monthly relays of 10,000. They'd stay a month in the Lebanon and then 2 months at home. Adinoram was in charge of the forced labor. Shlomo had 70,000 men to carry loads, another 80,000 stone cutters in the hills, besides Shlomo's 3,300 supervisors who were in charge of the people doing the work. The king gave orders They quarried large stones, expensive stones, to lay the foundation of the house with cut stone. Shlomo's and Hiram's builders, along with the men from Giv'al, worked the stones. They prepared the timber and stones for building the house. The first words of chapter 9 are that God gave Shlomo exceptional wisdom and understanding, as well as this vast heart. Now I want to look at these Hebrew words used here to put a finer point on what the intent of this passage is, because it goes a long way towards helping us to understand just who this famous man was. But it also helps us to better grasp just what wisdom is, as it's presented to us in the Bible anyway. Now the English word wisdom is in Hebrew chokhmah. Chokhmah. Understanding, the word understanding is tabana, and vast heart is rohav lev. Rohav lev. Now, chokhmah indeed means wisdom, but more in the sense of administrative acumen, good decision making, shrewdness, prudence. In other words, it's a practical type of wisdom that we all hope to have, but leaders in particular require it. We will appropriate this wisdom, this kind of wisdom, from only one of two sources: as a gift from the Lord, or it's going to come from our evil inclinations that lead us to deal with the world and all of our carnality. There is no separate Hebrew word for godly wisdom as opposed to carnal wisdom. Chokhmah covers both kinds, and it's within the context that we have to discern the lower kind versus the higher kind. Now, tabanah means understanding, but it also means it in the sense of an ability to apply the chokhmah, the wisdom, to any particular given situation. Understanding is what a teacher hopes to have, if they're a good teacher. And understanding also leads to using what is known from a variety of disciplines. Rohav lev, translated literally, means vast heart. But in modern Western thought and vocabulary, it means expansive mind. I'm going to remind you again that in the Bible, heart means mind, because from the earliest to the latest Bible times, it was believed by all known cultures that the heart organ was where conscious thought took place. So the idea within the incorporation of these three attributes of chokhmah, tabunah, and rohav lev to describe Solomon is that he explored and he understood a wide variety of knowledge. He was not a specialist. Rather, he was a brilliant generalist who had great skills, a lot of interest in many subjects and discipline. He is what we today might call a Renaissance man. Now, the term chokhmah is a generic term. It's used throughout the Bible for almost any kind of wisdom, whether it's spirit-filled or it's earthly kind. And it's immediately validated in verse 10 as we're told that Solomon had greater wisdom, greater chokhmah, than the children of the East or even the people of Egypt. Well, what kind of wisdom did Egypt and the children of the East possess? It was of two different kinds. The children of the East possessed cunning and shrewdness. It's the kind that we usually assign to Oriental traders and to merchants, good bargainers. From this point forward in the Bible, you can generally take any mention of the children of the East to be Ishmaelites, Arabs. Now, as for the Egyptians, they were known for their technology, for their engineering, for their science. They were early intellectuals. They excelled in advanced farming, in animal breeding techniques, in designing and building enormous structures, medicine, advancing the art of writing, new and latest military armaments. It is the kind of wisdom that today we assign to Western cultures. So it is within the context both of shrewdness in business and politics and intellectualism that Solomon is being praised. And the thing that's so critical for us to see is that although Solomon's great capacity for understanding and for knowledge came from Jehovah, that doesn't mean that Solomon always used it in ways that reflected Jehovah's will. Such is the challenge that faces all who call him Father. Just because as redeemed people we are given spiritual gifts doesn't mean we're going to use them correctly. The gift of spiritual gifts and abilities from the divine giver doesn't amputate us from our free will. It doesn't disable our evil inclination. These spiritual gifts are much like Abraham's covenant. They are divine promises. But how we use those gifts are much like the Mosaic covenant. There are conditions. There are choices that remain largely in our hands. We can choose righteously or we can choose wickedly. We can choose to use our God-given gifts for his purposes or for our own purposes. And verses 11 through 14 give us a number of disciplines in which Shlomo excelled as a writer of wisdom statements, proverbs, as a composer of inspirational poems and songs, as a botanist, as a biologist, as a politician and a leader. And from this point forward, now that Israel enjoyed prosperity and wealth and power never attained before or since, the most important work of his reign was now ready to be addressed. That was the building of a house unto the name of Jehovah. And what these first verses, starting at verse 15, tell us is that surprisingly, the Gentile nations will play a willing and pivotal role in the building of the temple. And the most prominent name among the Gentiles is Hiram, king of the Zor. Now, as often happens in the Bible, the same person or nation will go by several different names. And the mention of Zor is one of those instances. Zor, Sidon, and Phoenicia are all speaking of the same nation and people. We're told that Hiram loved David, and we need to be careful how we take that term love in this context and not think of it as meaning some kind of a deep affection or some sort of intense emotional attachment. See, when you have love between political leaders, it's a political term, and it's meant in the sense of loyalty and alliance. So Hiram was politically loyal to David and to Israel, and Zor had an uncommonly good and peaceful relationship with David that Hiram wished to extend now to his son Solomon. And Solomon, the diplomat, was certainly happy to accept it and to reciprocate. So Hiram sent his ambassadors to Shlomo, and Shlomo sent a letter back with them that respectfully asked the king of Zor to help Solomon build the temple. Now we get an interesting piece of information that apparently King David had shared with Hiram his great desire to build a house for God. He even discussed the actual blueprints and the plans he'd developed, even going so far as to begin to assemble materials for it. In 1 Chronicles, chapter 22, verse 1, we read, "Then David said, 'This is the house of Adonai God, and this is the altar Israel is to use for burnt offerings. David ordered that the foreigners in the land of Israel should be assembled and appointed stone workers to shape stones for building the house of God. David prepared a large store of iron from which to make nails and clamps for the gateway doors, and a quantity of bronze that was too great to weigh, cedar logs beyond numbering, because the Zidonim, the people from Zor, brought cedar logs in abundance to David. And David said, Shlomo my son is young and inexperienced, while the house to be built for Adonai must be so magnificent and splendid that its fame and glory will be known in every country, so I'll make the preparations for him. Therefore David made extensive preparations before his death. But as Solomon's message reported to Hiram, David never did build the temple because of the wars that had beset him on every side. But that's only partially true, because in 1 Chronicles 22:8, God goes on to tell David that you have shed much blood, fought great wars. You're not to build a house for my name because you shed so much blood on the earth in my sight. David had shed blood in fighting wars, just blood, and a lot of unjust blood in killing Bathsheba's husband and other rivals to the throne. So the Lord determined that David would not get the honor of building a house for God, but his son would. That son turned out to be Solomon. Therefore, the message from Solomon to Hiram continues that Solomon requests that Hiram have his people harvest timber from the cedar trees on his land, and part of that land, of course, includes Lebanon. But from what we know from 1 Chronicles is that Israel already had some of the timber they needed, because David had stockpiled it. Note that the lumber is not a gift and it's not tribute. Solomon made it clear he'd pay for it. In fact, Solomon would send laborers up to the Lebanon to assist Hiram's workers. But Hiram's men would be in charge because they were the experts in selecting and felling these large trees. King Hiram is pleased to hear of Solomon's intent to build a temple, and he compliments him for it. Now notice that the Bible has Hiram saying, "Blessed be Adonai today." It actually says, "Blessed be Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yehovah, today." That Hiram uses Yehovah's name in no way means that he worshiped the God of Israel. It's simply that he knows of Israel's God, he respects Israel's God and Israel's worship of him. And while the situation is not identical, it is similar. I think this offers Christians an example of how to relate to modern-day Israel and to the Jewish people. While we don't agree with their stance regarding Messiah Yeshua, we can certainly agree that both Christianity and Judaism worship the God of Israel, Yehovah, and we share strong faith roots and values. And as a result, we can show them respect and loyalty at the very least. The unfortunate attitude among too many believers of denouncing Israel, and so siding with their enemies on account of Israel's regrettable stance against Jews accepting Yeshua, is wrong-minded. We ought to be the Jewish people's greatest and most faithful friends, if for no other reason than enlightened self-interest. Because the Bible makes it clear in the Old and New Testaments that those who befriend Israel shall be blessed. Those who come against Israel shall be dealt with harshly by God. So help yourself out. The cedar forests of Lebanon, where this precious commodity of large trees were located, was about a 2 days journey north of Beirut. Yep, that Beirut. And it was a long way from there to Jerusalem. Great skill was needed, not only to harvest these trees, but to select exactly the right ones. But even more, there was much know-how needed to transport these large logs all that distance. And they had this ingenious way of doing it. They took the logs to the Mediterranean seashore and they made huge rafts out of them. Then they sailed them down the coast to Israel. More than likely, the Israeli port they used in that era was Jaffa. Upon arrival, they would disassemble the rafts, separate them into the logs, transport them by ox cart then to Jerusalem. Pretty clever. Now Hiram agreed to all this. No doubt it was to a large degree prearranged by David, and essentially Solomon merely had to say the word to set this plan into motion. And he also told Solomon that the price for his participation was going to be the provision of food for his entire royal household. In other words, the government of Zor. And verse 25 records that Solomon agreed to provide 100,000 bushels of wheat and 1,000 gallons of olive oil to Hiram each and every year that Hiram was providing wood. Now that is a lot of food. Even though we're not really sure of exactly the amount, because although most Bibles will say bushels and gallons, or perhaps measures, the Hebrew word is actually kor, K-O-R, kor, in both instances. And what the original Hebrew says is that the amounts paid are ezrim elef kor of wheat and ezrim kor of olive oil, which translates to 20,000 kor of wheat and 20 kor of olive oil. Now the question is, anybody here know what a kor is? How much a kor is? Neither does anybody else. It's a little bit hazy, because a kor is technically a unit of dry measurement. And here it's used for both dry measurement, wheat, and a liquid measurement, oil. But here's the thing. A kor is the largest unit of dry measurement in the Hebrew vocabulary, in the same way that elef, 1,000, that's the largest number unit in the Hebrew vocabulary. And a kor is really only an approximate amount. It's not an exact weight or measure. It is defined in general as the maximum amount of whatever the product is that a donkey can carry, fully loaded down. So another term we could use for a kor, and we'd be right, is a donkey load. So Solomon had to pay Hiram 20,000 donkey loads of wheat and 20 donkey loads of olive oil per year. So just go home, measure your donkey, and you'll know how much a kor is. Now at verse 27, we get a troubling report, because it says that Solomon conscripted 30,000 men from Israel to send to Lebanon to help cut and to transport these giant cedar trees in 10,000-man rotations of 1 month stay. Now I say it's troubling because, like the many horses that Solomon had amassed, in ordering his people into forced labor, Solomon was behaving like a typical pagan Gentile despot and monarch, and not like the godly shepherd that he was supposed to be. In a certain sense, these and other similar actions of Solomon were a fulfillment of a prophetic warning by the prophet Solomon, as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 8. We're going to take a look at that right quick. 1 Samuel chapter 8, and that would be verses 10 through 18, which is on page 305 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. 1 Samuel chapter 8, starting at verse 10. Samuel, reported everything Adonai had said to the people, asking him for a king. And he said, here is the kind of rulings your king is going to make. He'll draft your sons. He'll assign them to take care of his chariots, be his horsemen, be his bodyguards, running ahead of his chariots. He'll appoint them to serve him as officers in charge of thousands or of 50, plowing his fields, gathering his harvest, making his weapons, and the equipment for his chariots. He'll take your daughters, have them be perfume makers and cooks and bakers. He'll expropriate your fields, vineyards, olive groves, the very best of them. and he'll hand them over to his servants. He'll take the 10% of tax of your crops and vineyards and give it to his officers and his servants. He'll take your male and female servants, your best young men and your donkeys, and make them work for him. He'll take the 10% tax of your flocks, and you will become his servants. And when that happens, oh, you'll cry out on account of your king, whom you yourselves chose. But when that happens, Adonai will not answer you. But these commands that Solomon gave, all these were just the beginning. In order to quarry stones now for the temple, Solomon enlisted 150,000 men to cut and carry those stones. 150,000. 70,000 were used to transport the load. 80,000 were stone cutters. Then Solomon set over them 3,300 supervisors. We get a little more detail now about this in 2 Chronicles. In 2 Chronicles 2, 16 and 17, we read this. Shlomo took a census of all the foreigners in the land of Israel, following the pattern of the census of David his father. There were found to be 153,600. He appointed 70,000 of them to carry loads, 80,000 to be stonecutters in the hills, and 3,600 as supervisors to assign the people to work. Now, some explanation is needed in determining exactly who these 153,600 were, who he counted in this special sentence. The term that is translated as foreigner, at least in the complete Jewish Bible, is translated in a number of ways in other Bibles as aliens, strangers, men, sojourners, and a few other terms as well. But the variety of English terms used is because the Hebrew word being translated is Enosh ha-gerim, and it literally means mankind of the Gentiles. Mankind of the Gentiles. If this were the only factor, we could simply say that these were resident alien Gentiles living in Israel. However, in the next verse, it says that the overseers, the supervisors, were set over these Am. And the term Am, which is usually translated as people, is actually referring to kindred people. Meaning, in this case, of course, kindred to Israel. So, in some way or another, these people were considered as part of Israel. The bottom line is that some of the modern translators have started to use the English word proselytes. And I think they've kind of nailed it. These people were Gentiles who came to live among Israel. So they gave their allegiance to Israel and to Israel's God. But they tended to live within their own ethnic groups, as has been common among foreign immigrants from time immemorial right up till today. No doubt they were somewhat recent to Israel, and since they weren't natural-born Hebrews and had not sought full assimilation yet into the Hebrew culture, it was a lot less of a political problem for Solomon to conscript them to this hard and unpleasant labor instead of natural-born Hebrews, because they were ethnically different from the rest of the Israelites. Nonetheless, no doubt these 150,000 men used to quarry the stones for the temple were former Gentiles who were now official Israelis by their own choice. The ending verses of chapter 5 makes it clear that even the foundation stones of the temple were cut and quarried and shaped. That is, they weren't slightly modified boulders that would be used as the foundation, which was pretty typical for that era. Cut stones were usually used when they were visible. Foundation stones, of course, were all underground. We get an interesting note that the men from Zor worked with the men from Israel to get the job done. And also a group of men from a place called Gebal were pressed into action. Gebal is also known as Byblos. which is a little bit north of Beirut. Let's move on to chapter 6. We're just going to read a very few verses this evening. 1 Kings chapter 6, just verses 1 through 5. If you've got a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 373. It was in the 480th year after the people of Israel had left the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Shlomo's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, that he began to build the house of Adonai. The house which King Shlomo built for Adonai is 105 feet long, 35 feet wide, and 52.5 feet high. The hall fronting the temple of this house was 35 feet long, the same as the width of the house itself, so that its 17.5 foot width extended frontward from the house. The windows he made for the house were wide on the inside and narrow on the outside. And against the wall of the house he built an annex all the way around it. It went all the way around the walls at the house, including both the temple and the sanctuary. It was in the 4th year of Shlomo's reign that the construction of the temple began. Now there's great disagreement, because there's no way to know for sure, what constituted, at least in the Bible writer's mind, the beginning of construction. Was it the ordering of the materials from Hiram? Was it the arrival of the first foundation stones? Was it when the foundation was completed? We don't know the criteria, and I'm not about to add to the already long list of guesses. Even the meaning of the 4th year of Solomon's reign isn't precise, because the ancients had varying ways of specifying a king's reign. Now, because many Bible students and other Christians get all bound up in Bible chronology and calendar debates, not only accusing one another, but even accusing the scriptures of being in error about some of these matters. I'm going to take us on a very brief detour at this point to discuss this issue of measuring the time of a king's reign. Now, this is because the time of a king's reign had much to do with setting historical time markers in the ancient days. And so, Bible chronology and all the variant chronologies that we use today depend on the dates that certain kings were in office. In a nutshell, the issue is that the method a king's reign was measured in changed with time. And it changed within the culture he lived and within the culture that then went on to report that king's reign. In other words, the Bible not only talks about Hebrew kings, but it talks about foreign kings as well. And we have developed some of our Bible chronology from extra-biblical, in other words, outside the Bible documents, because the Bible at times doesn't give us the needed information, but ancient documents from some other nations do. But the question then becomes, well, then what time method did that culture use to determine a king's reign? Well, briefly, we'll finish up with this tonight. There are 5 different protocols used in antiquity and in the Bible to define the chronology of a monarch. They are called the regnal year, the accession year, the post-dating system, the non-accession year, and co-regency. In the regnal year, this was when the official royal year began at the start of the new year. However, it was backdated to the previous new year. For the Hebrews, the new year was usually considered as Nisan. This was the same, by the way, up in Mesopotamia. But it gets more complicated, because it seems that after Solomon, the northern kingdom of Israel, remember it's split, the northern kingdom of Israel adopted the month of Tishri, the 7th month to be the month of the new year. So the southern kingdom of Judah used the month of Nisan, the first month, as the new year. Second of all, the second method is called the accession year. This determines that a king's first year takes place in whatever time there is between the actual date of his coronation until we arrive at the new year. So, a king could take the throne 1 week before the new year, and upon the new year, he now enters the second year of reign. His first year of reign could even be only days. Then third is what's called the post-dating system. This system counts a king's first year as the first full year beginning after New Year's. Therefore, a king could assume the throne many months before New Year, and it's not counted towards his period of reign. Only after passing the next New Year is it now considered his first year of reign. So he could be on the throne for 11 months, and none of that time's counted, because the clock doesn't start until he reaches the first new year after his coronation. Then there's the non-accession year. This method doesn't pay any attention to New Year's, but rather only to the actual date that the king assumes an office. So 1 year from his actual date of coronation ends his first year and begins the second year. That one usually makes the most sense to us. And finally, there's what's called co-regency. Now, this refers to the designation of the royal heir during the lifetime of the sitting king. So, just like with David and Solomon, David was still living, he was still king, when he named Solomon as his royal heir, and within hours, Solomon assumed the throne. But it also appears that David didn't give up the throne. Rather, there was sort of a senior king and junior king operating at the same time. So the end of David's time as king does not coincide with Solomon's beginning time as king. Instead, it only ends at David's reign only ends at his death. Solomon becoming king then overlaps during the remaining time that David was still king. Now, there's nothing right or wrong or better or worse among all these various systems. Often the choice of a dating system seemed to be at the whim of the king, or it changed according to a circumstance for one king. And then his successor maybe measured his reign in a whole different way. Even more, it at times appears that the writer or the editor of the book did the choosing. And frankly, we only rarely even know which method they used, because it's not recorded using these kinds of names I just used. The bottom line is, you know all these nice, neat biblical timelines we see printed out in beautiful color foldouts? All the various kings of Israel and Judah, or about all the judges, or generally any other succession of national or regional leaders. They're not absolute. They're just approximates. So we're going to see some significant variations among them. Now, next week, we're going to delve into one of the most important and seminal events in the entire Bible, the building of the first temple to Jehovah. Please rise.
Yeshua,